Welcome to Non-Toxic. I'm your host, Daniel Penny. Last time we talked with Jessica DeFino about changing beauty standards for men, and I was planning to run an episode with Dr. Roberto Olivaria, who is a researcher into muscle dysmorphia and body image issues among men. However, given recent events, I decided to run an election special. If you've been following this show, you know that we've been talking about the crisis of masculinity in the US for a long time, way before this particular election. In school, boys and young men are falling behind girls and failing to graduate at the same rates. Wages for most American men haven't improved in 50 years in real terms, and more than 10% of American men in their prime working years have dropped out of the workforce. Fentanyl addiction and overdoses have become a regular part of life. And men are 4 times as likely to die by suicide as women, 5 times as likely to go to prison. And the life expectancy of the average American male has fallen to 75, which is 5 years less than the average for a woman in America. So in short, American men are looking around and thinking, rightly, that things are not going well for them. And in the absence of a compelling narrative from the left or a coherent plan from centrists, the right has really stepped in to offer some convincing explanations. They've got plenty of scapegoats: feminism, migrants, DEI training, trans people, and of course there's the out-of-touch liberal elite represented by Kamala Harris. And young men aged 18 to 29 ate it up. To understand what happened, I'm speaking with Shauna Daly, co-founder of the Young Men Research Initiative. Shauna's a longtime Democratic campaign operative and researcher who's worked on the Obama campaigns and many Senate campaigns. And her warnings about young men, unfortunately, weren't heeded until it was already too late. But she's gotten a lot of excellent insights into how young men voted, why they voted the way they did, and what the Democratic Party might do to try to win them back. Well, Shauna, thank you so much for coming on Non-Toxic. I really appreciate it, especially under such short notice.
Glad to be here.
Let's just get into it. The big story, I think, for this election is that many young men, not just white men, but also Black men, Asian men, Latino men, came out for Trump. And while young women overwhelmingly voted for Harris, what was the exact gender divide, and how unusual was the split in 2024 versus previous elections?
Well, in previous elections, there has traditionally been something of a gender divide. That's not super unusual, but it has really expanded this year, particularly for young people. And so it was kind of a flip, that women went about 40% for Trump and 56% for Harris. And it was just about the opposite for men, with about 56 for Trump and a little bit over 40 going for Harris. So this big explosion in the gender gap is really what's changed this year. And that is unique to younger cohorts. So that's definitely the story that we've been focused on for this cycle. And there's no sign of any sort of snapback to some normalcy or the genders sort of coming back together. So this will be a story for a while to come.
I would say this isn't the way things were supposed to work out. Like, many liberal political commentators and operatives assumed that, Gen Z would just follow in the footsteps of millennials in this shift to the left from, I guess, Gen X and boomers who had kind of operated in the center and to the right. And a lot of people are really confused about this. Like, did the Dems lose the election because Kamala just didn't go on Joe Rogan? Or does this election reflect a deeper problem with the Democrats' understanding of kind of the state of masculinity and kind of the story they have about it?
Well, there's a lot there. I mean, Harris, she lost a lot of different cohorts. So this certainly cannot be all about young men. But young men shifted away from Biden more than any other cohort. So everybody did, the national numbers, but young men shifted away from the top of the ticket. 15 points from 4 years ago. So they definitely were sort of leading there. But, and, that certainly was not all just about Joe Rogan. Should she have gone on Joe Rogan? Of course. But that was not the entire story. Joe Rogan is kind of an avatar for a new media that is both about podcasts, but it's also about a more casual, less structured kind of conversation that Democrats have not traditionally been very comfortable with. And Trump did very well there. It's sort of a natural environment for him. I will say that a lot of those shows are also not particularly challenging to their guests. I mean, Trump was able to talk, to sort of filibuster, as he often does. The hosts on those shows don't come back a whole lot with a lot of fact checking. On the other hand, the nature of those shows, because of their length, I mean, a Rogan episode can be 3 hours. Their length allows them to go in all kinds of different directions. And there were real moments on some of those shows where Trump opened up in ways that he hadn't in any other time. Like, he talked about his brother's alcoholism and actually showed interest in one of the hosts and asked him a question, which Trump never does. So it's a different medium, and people who have been trained, I mean, in politics, we train candidates how to appear in the media and how to deal with questions. And podcasts just don't do well with that sort of training, or people who are prepared for that sort of engagement. And that's something that Harris and other Democrats just need to get more comfortable with in the future, because that's clearly where people's interest is going. And that's, people are less trusting of anybody who seems too packaged, or institutions. People are really looking for what they view as authenticity. And that's what they think that they're getting from a lot of those podcasts.
And I suppose maybe on the flip side for Oppo, when those podcasts go really long and meandering, people do tend to relax and sometimes say things that they probably shouldn't say because they think they're just like among friends. There have been a lot of clips of JD Vance saying some insane things on right-wing podcasts because he just felt like, oh, we all agree here.
Right. Yeah. That's one traditional interview technique, has been like, give people space, sort of give them, the rope to hang themselves is a negative spin on it, but it sort of forces the guests to talk and to fill up the space, which can lead to interesting places.
So I think the big issue that the Dems ran on, other than save democracy, which is a sort of abstract issue, was preserve the right to birth control and abortion and like sexual health and reproductive decisions. And that was ultimately not enough to take Harris to the White House. Neo-Nazi Nick Fuentes is posting on X, your body, my choice. Does that reflect the views of the young men who voted for Trump? Do they actually believe that? Or is that something that they just kind of take with a grain of salt as the kind of classic Trump apologist line?
They don't generally agree with that. Young men are generally fairly pro-choice, but it's certainly not as important an issue to them as it is for young women. And overall, really, if you ask men on any issue, they care less about it than women do. So if that's how you're measuring it, like, do you think this issue is very important? Women will all say any issue is more important than men do. So gun violence, climate, anything. And so what it really...
Wait, to pause there to explain, all social issues, when surveyed, women respondents will say that they are will rate them with more significance than male respondents.
Yes. And it's just that those issues don't motivate men. And when you ask young men about their opinions on different issues, they largely agree with the Democratic platform, whether you're talking about providing health care or any number of other issues that the Democrats think that we're campaigning on. Young men agree with us, is that we're not really communicating it well, and not communicating it in a way that conveys that those issues affect men's lives. So we use this example of the healthcare bill, of like Obamacare. And one of the big provisions of it was allowing young people to stay on their parents' health insurance until they were 26. And that disproportionately helped young men who oftentimes have jobs that don't provide them health care. But it is never talked about that way. It's never marketed that way. And the same is true of, the infrastructure bill that was passed, which created all kinds of, traditionally male hard hat jobs. But we don't talk about them as things that benefit men, whereas there are all, any number of issues that we talk about and explicitly say this helps women, whether it's childcare or, various other things. And that's something that we have not been comfortable with on the Democratic side. And I would advocate for us getting comfortable with it because, the underlying issue here is that young men are hurting and are having real challenges. They are not making as much money as their fathers and grandfathers. They are less likely to be getting married and starting families, less likely to be buying a house, while women have actually surpassed them. And women are enrolling in college at higher rates than young men. And in some geographic areas, earning more money on average than their male cohorts. Men in general are sort of overrepresented at the ends of both spectrums, right? So, at CEOs and billionaires, but also the people who are doing really badly. Whereas women
more likely
on
to be
average,
homeless, more likely to be in prison.
and those are real things. And men are concerned about their mental health. And interestingly, that's not a particularly ideological difference. I mean, Democrats and Republican men both say that mental health should be getting more attention, which to me, as someone who has worked in politics, that says this is an opportunity for us that we should be seizing. This is something that people are saying that they want. It's bipartisan, and we should be going after that and creating solution. But that's something that's maybe in the coming years, Democrats will get more comfortable with doing.
Though I have to say my initial instinct with that is like the expression of saying like mental health is an issue for me is not that like, well, I want Democrats to have like a means tested public-private, policy that like I have to apply for and maybe get like 6 months from now for free visits for cognitive behavioral therapy, which is like basically what the Dem version of that would be, right?
It's an interesting question. I am not primarily a policy person, but
I think the issue is real. I think so often people have not responded to the solutions that Democrats have proposed in this cycle because they have felt extremely watered down. They lack coherence. They don't tell an overall story. And they seem very kind of in the weeds in policy speak and not sort of connecting with values or emotions or one's aspirations for one's life.
yeah, I think that's fair. I think that we, to some degree, have become a sort of technocratic party and haven't done a great job of listening to the people, even the ones who we say that we're fighting for. We like to say that we're the party of working people, but clearly there are concerns of working people around inflation that a lot of Democrats said, the economy is great because my, 401k is doing great. But if you're a lower income bracket and inflation is something that you see day to day, then telling people that their perception of it is wrong is bad politics.
I'm talking to Shauna Daly, co-founder of the Young Men Research Initiative. We'll be talking more about how men consume media and the way that the Trump campaign managed to meet them where they're at, and whether Dems will ever be able to do the same. More of our conversation in a moment. But first, a message from our sponsors. Non-Toxic is sponsored by Blue Corn Candles. They're a Colorado-based candle company making some excellent beeswax candles. Get yourself some this holiday season, or maybe just to console yourself in the wake of this terrifying election. You can use the code non-toxic, capital N, capital T, 20 to get 20% off your first order. Now back to our show. Let's talk about shaping perceptions. There was a recent Wall Street Journal story about Barron Trump advising his dad about which podcasts to go on to win the bro vote. But I think, the Trump strategy extended beyond Joe Rogan and Logan Paul and the Nelk boys and things like that. The campaign really seized this idea of like meeting young men where they're at digitally. Can you talk a little bit about the findings of the Young Men Research Initiative? Like, where are men consuming their information that then helps them make political decisions?
So young men over-index on YouTube and on Twitter. And certainly the Twitter numbers have really went up in the last few months. I think that there's a perception that Twitter is a place where, sort of journalists mostly get their news. And I think that's really changed recently. So they're not only more likely than their female peers to consume YouTube and Twitter, but older demographics as well. And a little bit less so, but also the same with podcasts. So, the stories coming out of this election really are ones where young men are really at the center of it. And young men are spending a ton of time on YouTube, which I think that a lot of people have a perception that YouTube is just about getting them 2 clicks to entertain. It might be a few more clicks than that. But the point is that there's a whole ecosystem. And really, like anything that a young guy is likely to be interested in, if they're watching videos about sports or about any number of other hobbies, fitness, all of those spaces and those influencers have really been brought into in a way that the left really just hasn't had a master plan on. The right really did and does. That is a longstanding disparity that goes back decades. The right has had a better understanding of the media environment and the benefits of both owning media and shaping what you don't own to a degree that Democrats really haven't.
To that point, Tara Lawrence recently published an essay in her Substack about the failure of the left to build that alternative to the right-wing media ecosystem. But, her argument, and I'm going to boil it down a bit, is like, basically, Democrats never will because rich lib donors aren't interested in dirtbag left podcasts because those podcasts are very much critical of the donor class, whereas there's much more alignment on the right because, the Koch brothers or, whoever can kind of fund all of these things. And as long as it's getting them the tax breaks that they want, they're sort of fine with that bargain because it comes out to their advantage. Like, do you think that the sort of contradiction there between like the left base or whatever you want to call it, the progressive wing of the party and the donor class of the Democratic Party, like, is that a contradiction that can be solved in order to create compelling content essentially? Or is this something that we haven't really figured out?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's nothing inherently Republican about getting in shape, or sports. So I think that certainly there's plenty of ways that Democrats and the left can engage with young men about the culture that they are engaging with as it is.
I'd like to think this podcast is one of those.
Sure. Yes. I mean, I don't think that the Koch brothers, I think that they would be pretty turned off by hanging out with the Nelk boys. I mean, but they are what they are willing to do, and what the funders on the right are willing to do is understand that there are people who they don't agree with all the time. And on the left, we demand some more purity. And if people make us uncomfortable, if they agree with us, 70% of the time, but disagree 30%, then that's sort of not enough. And I mean, not to make this all about Rogan, but he is pro-choice and is in favor of, universal health care. He is someone who I don't think that would ever be a Democrat. And I don't think that the Democratic Party would ever embrace him, but being comfortable with engaging with someone who we disagree with some of the time, even if it's the 70-30 the other way, if we think that we only agree with them on 30%, but it's worth, maybe their audience is a bit more diverse, and so it's worth engaging.
This is
That
like the Pete
ought to be,
Buttigieg going on Fox strategy.
yeah, I mean, everybody should be doing this. And the idea that a lot of these outlets are hardcore right wing and therefore beyond approach, it's just not accurate. And we lose out on potential voters. And, I think that's to our detriment. We have to learn how to do that, even if it makes us uncomfortable.
Though, of course, like one could say, when you watch sometimes like Fox, sometimes they have a liberal commentator or a Democrat who's just there to be the kind of like group punching bag or like the gimp, essentially. And like, you don't really want to debase yourself by agreeing to be that person. And also, then it kind of like creates the illusion of ideological balance when in fact, like the show is deeply sort of structured in one way or the perspective is quite clear. And so like I understand the hesitance on the part of commentators or politicians to go there because they're not playing on a fair field, but maybe they still need to play.
For sure. Yeah, it's not a fair field. But I would also say that, by staying in safe spaces, I mean, it's similar to exercise, right? I mean, if you aren't doing the hard stuff, then you're not improving. And by when you do engage in places like Fox, it makes you more, intellectually agile. And I think that's an argument for why primaries, which are painful and messy, result in better candidates because they're forced to defend their ideas in front of all kinds of audiences over an extended period of time and really think through their policy positions and why they're running. And I think that, Harris didn't have that. And I think I think
Yeah.
it showed.
I will also say, I'm not a fan of JD Vance in any way, but he was much better prepared for the debate with Tim Walz, I thought, because he's been like a talking head for years. Like he's so used to engaging in that way. And just, yeah, his rhetoric skills are really sharp. They only get sharp if you're in like a hostile situation now and again.
And I admit that I wouldn't really want to do it, but I'm not running for office. And so I think that Democrats need to understand that is the media environment now. We can't stay in scripted environments. Like I mean, I spent a lot of years sort of training candidates and, for like debates and appearing on TV. And it's like, okay, here's your 60-second answer because that's the format. And people get good at that. But that's just not the environment that we operate in anymore. And so we need to adjust.
So what's the plan for winning back young men to the Democratic Party? Because I think, there are a lot of kind of contrary lessons that people seem to be drawing in the kind of centrist liberal media spaces, like, oh, we were too woke, or like we didn't embrace Liz Cheney enough. I thought that was hilarious. Or like it's those student protesters, like they're the problem. I've seen a lot of blame going around and not a lot of like, maybe like our vibes are bad. Like maybe like we don't speak the same language as American people anymore. Or like maybe it's not just like racism and misogyny, which are all real. Those are still real, but also like we elected Obama in 2008, so the idea that like race can't be overcome, I don't think applies in the case of Harris. And like Trump lost in 2020. So it's not like he has this sort of magic power that can't be beaten. And so, yeah, it does kind of raise questions that I haven't seen very good answers yet from Democrats, at least in public. I'm not privy to the conversations they're having in private.
Yeah, I would say that while young men did swing to Trump, I certainly don't think that they're lost to Democrats forever or a lost cause. I think that their support is somewhat squishy. And in surveys, if you ask about their partisan alignment, they don't really like Republicans, they don't really like Democrats. They sort of don't really like labels. They like Trump as a person. Or even not necessarily that they would want to hang out with him, but they like him as a candidate. And I think that it is all of the above. Certainly, this media environment is something that needs to be taken seriously, and we need new infrastructure to deal with that. Young men were at the leading edge of embracing these forms of media, but certainly women and older men are using them as well. The vibes or culture that you mentioned, that's certainly part of it. Young men in surveys say that they don't think the Democratic Party looks out for them or looks out for guys like them. They feel like some of this is a backlash to Me Too. It's a cohort that came of age.
They were in high
And
school and college during Me Too and COVID.
yeah, and I think that we can both say that, Me Too was a reaction to a long history of mistreatment of women, and also say that maybe there were some excesses and that maybe some men, particularly young men, really felt confused about what this meant for them. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a culture piece of it. And lastly, there is issues. I mean, that we should be able to make the sale to men that democratic policies will make their lives better. I mean, that's in a democracy, people are allowed to ask what is in it for them. I mean, that is it. And if Democrats can't make that argument to young men, not because it's better to vote for Democrats for their sister or their girlfriend or, other marginalized groups, but for them. And that's something that is totally acceptable for any other demographic, for farmers or for Latinos, or like any group is allowed to say, why is your party better than the other for me? And why are you going to make my life better? And so, a lot of democratic policies do that. We just don't talk about it that way. As I mentioned, some of the jobs and infrastructure stuff and healthcare, those are existing policies that we don't talk about their impact on young men's lives. But there are certainly additional policies, that what exactly something targeting men's mental health would look like, I don't know. But there's proposals around getting more men in schools or as teachers, or changing how we treat boys in schools who, are more likely to have disciplinary issues. And so, like, maybe we should be adjusting how we think about those sorts of things so that fewer boys are being sent off to the principal's office. But I think that there's other work to be explored. There's a lot of funding, both government and nonprofit, around women's health, women's entrepreneurship, women's equality overall. And I think those are good things. We can do those and also do programs targeted at men, not just because we want to say that we're doing both, but because both are needed.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of hard work to be done the next 4 years. I mean, mostly just kind of trying to hold up the institutions and make sure they survive until 2028. But I'm really excited to read more of the research that you're putting out. Where can the people find you if they want to follow along with your research and insights?
So right now, everything is on our Substack, which is Young Men Research Initiatives. And hopefully in the near future, we will be able to get some more investment to do more work and maybe have a standalone website and everything.
Okay. Well, Shauna Daly, thank you so much for coming on Non-Toxic. It was a pleasure to hear from you and just to get a bit of a deeper insight into the state of how young men broke off from the Democratic Party and how they might potentially be wooed back. I hope that you guys get that investment that you need. And maybe then we can turn some of these ideas into policies.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
And that's it for this episode of Non-Toxic. As always, I'm your host, Daniel Penny. This episode was produced by Loose Thread Studios with help from Andrew Lewis. And the music is by Nathan Sharp. Artwork by Sam Creasy. Thanks for listening, and we'll be back in 2 weeks with a conversation with Dr. Roberto Olivardio. about muscle dysmorphia and young men. If you'd like to support the show, go to patreon.com/nontoxicpodcast and sign up to become a supporter today. Every little bit you send us helps us detoxify the discourse, and I think we can all agree it's pretty toxic right now.